You're listening to the 41st broadcast of TBR Radios, the TBR History Hour, with your host, TBR Contributing Editor, Dr. Edward DeVries. Our guest on today's show is Pastor Raphael Cruz, the father of Texas Senator, and 2016 presidential candidate, Ted Cruz. Raphael tells his story of fighting in the Cuban Revolution with Fidel Castro and then how and why he had to flee Cuba as communism took over the island nation. Coming to Texas and then living in Canada and the United States, our guest has watched as the same Marxism, the same communism, that ruined Cuba, is rising here in the United States and Canada. Fidel's message was one of hope and change. Do those words sound familiar? Of course, that change comes through wealth redistribution. Stay tuned.
Recently, I was invited to Dallas, Texas by my good friend Dr. Paul Blair, the former professional football player, played for the Bears. And Paul, of course, had been a guest on our other show. TBR Radio presents the Dixie Heritage Hour and the Dixie Heritage Show back in 2017, 2018, back down in there somewhere. I can't remember when now. I just remember having had him on the show a few times. Anyways, Paul put together a wonderful conference in Dallas, Texas, and had invited me to come and be a part of it. And he had also invited Raphael Cruz. Raphael Cruz being the father of Senator Ted Cruz. And so it gave me the opportunity to become more familiar with Raphael, and he's our guest today on the program TBR Radio presents the TBR History Hour. Brother Cruz, let me just say that it is an honor for me to be able to have you on our radio show today.
It's so great to be with you.
I'm going to start with this question because it's what's on everybody's mind right now. The Donald Trump-Joe Biden debate. What did you think about that?
I thought it went very well. I thought actually the public, the people of America had a chance to listen to the candidates talk about the issues. And, the voters deserve to hear from the candidates as to where they stand on the different issues and look at their records. I think that's the most important thing of all.
Brother Cruz, it was so kind of you to give me a copy of your book, A Time for Action. Just tell our audience quickly, why did you write the book and why now?
Well, I wrote this book because I have a great burden for America. America has been on a down spiral for quite some time, and that down spiral has accelerated in the last 7 years, where we have seen a totally lawless administration. We've seen rampant attack on religions, more specifically attack on Christianity. And at the same time, we have seen that the people of faith have become absent from the political process. And as a result of that, we have seen politicians elected that were not the best that we could have had. And so I feel a burden to awaken people of faith, awaken the body of Christ, awaken pastors to their civic responsibility to be involved in the political arena. And I do that both from a historical standpoint and also from a biblical standpoint.
Well, obviously, you're addressing a very important subject here, and that is that the pastors, the pulpits, and the churches of America have basically withdrawn themselves from the civil discourse and have stopped speaking to the political issues of our country and our society. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it started very early. First of all, in 1954, when the Johnson Amendment was passed, the church became scared. And the Johnson Amendment was a very, very simple amendment, which just said 501c3 organizations are prohibiting from speaking in favor or against candidates for public office. That basically many churches saw as a threat if they say anything about the civic society. And then, we have seen the consequences of that, as I detail to a great extent in my book, A Time for Action. 1962, prayer was removed from school. 1963, the Bible was removed from school. The Bible had been a textbook in schools for over a century, public schools. But in spite of those two abominable decisions, the church remained silent. And their excuse was, it's a political issue. How could you call prayer a political issue? How could you call Bible reading a political issue? The consequence of that silence, after 1963, teen pregnancy skyrocketed, and so did violent crime. And then we saw it in 1973 when Roe v. Wade was passed. 9 unelected justices decided that a baby in the womb did not have that unalienable right to life from our Creator, as stated in the Declaration of Independence, and they legalized abortion. Again, the church remained silent. Same excuse, it's a political issue. The consequence, 58 million babies have been butchered through abortion in those years since then. You know, it is the great sin of America. And we need to get back to the Judeo-Christian principles that have made America great. The question is, how long are we going to remain silent? And the more important question is, are we going to have to answer to God for our silence?
But the issues have gotten so much more intense even since the debate on whether or not they should have prayer in the public school or Bible reading in the public school. I mean, now we're seeing it where, you know, abortion has become a quote-unquote constitutional right. In other words, rather than children having the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness endowed with that right by their Creator, according to the Declaration of Independence, well, now the mother has the right to murder her child. Or, you know, marriage being redefined, and so instead of Adam and Eve, now you have Adam and Steve. I mean, these are just fundamental moral issues, and we can't even get pastors to speak to these things.
Well, I think, unfortunately, you have many pastors that want to be politically correct instead of being biblically correct. And they also fear that, well, if they say anything that is controversial, that people would leave the church, and, you know, but, you know, they have a responsibility, like the Bible tells us, to preach the whole counsel of God. And not only that, people in a congregation look at their pastor as their spiritual leader. And if the Bible says that if the pastor does not lead, the church is scattered as a sheep without a shepherd. So we have a responsibility to be able to lead people in the way of righteousness. You know, if we don't, what's going to happen, you know, so often you hear Christians, pastors saying, well, politics is a dirty business. I don't want any part of it. Well, if people of principle do not get involved in politics, do not vote, do not run for office, what is left? People without principle being elected, voted in by people without principles. It behooves those who hold fast to those great Christian principles, constitutional principles that have been the bedrock of America, to make sure that we elect candidates that uphold those principles. That's what has made America the greatest country on the face of the earth. We must return to our foundations.
Pastor Cruz, you were so kind as to record for us your testimony of what happened when you were growing up in Cuba and your activity in Fidel's revolution against the Bautista regime. And we will be playing that at the end of today's broadcast. But I just want to ask you here and now, during the interview portion, are there any parallels between what you're seeing in America now and what you experienced in Cuba?
Oh, absolutely. And I saw that parallel long before. You know, when I left Cuba, after seeing the damage of socialism in Cuba, communism, I was so glad to be in this wonderful country of ours. I am so proud to be an American. But in the late 70s, I saw similar policies begin to be instituted here. We remember the Carter years, 22% interest rates, 18% inflation, double-digit unemployment, lines around the block to get gasoline. A government so weak in foreign policy that Iran had captured 52 Americans and held them hostage for 444 days. Because of all of that, I became involved with an organization called the Religious Roundtable. And we mobilized millions of Christians across America to help elect what I considered the greatest president, President Ronald Reagan. And it was people of faith that mobilized millions to elect Ronald Reagan. We did it in 1980. We can do it again.
Of course, I know that when you were working in the Reagan campaign that you had only been a Christian for a short time. a lot of our listeners may mistakenly believe that you were a Christian even as a young man living in Cuba. Of course, that is not your testimony. So would you just go ahead and just clear everything up and just go ahead and share your testimony of how you became a Christian and when?
I came to Christ in 1975. I was 36 years old. I was involved in the oil industry. I was actually drinking too much, and I did business at the bar. I met clients at the bar before, during work and after work, and that took a toll on my family. So when my son was still 3 years old, I left my wife and son and I went to Houston. And I had been in Houston for about 4 months when a friend of mine that had sold me a computer invited me to a Bible study. Well, I went to that Bible study. I don't even remember what that Bible study was about, but what I do remember is that they had a time of prayer after the Bible study. And in prayer requests, I noticed that all these people had problems. I remember one woman that talked about her son beating her to get money for drugs. And yet she had a peace that I could not understand. It's a peace that the Bible calls a peace that surpasses all understanding. Something that I didn't have and sorely needed. Well, the hostess of that Bible study gave me a little booklet when I left called The Four Spiritual Laws and said, "Why don't you read these and come back next Monday, please? We'd love to have you." So I went back the next Monday. She asked me, "What did you think of the booklet?" I said, "Well, it's too easy. It can't be that easy." Well, she didn't know how to answer me. So the next day, she invited me to come to her house where her pastor was going to be. At 7 o'clock at night, I spent 4 hours arguing with this pastor. I was a scientist. I thought I had all the answers. I thought religion was a crutch. I called myself an atheist. Well, after 4 hours of just giving this pastor a hard time, I remember the last question I asked this pastor. It was about 11 o'clock at night, and I said, "Pastor Wiley, let me ask you a question. What about that man up in the mountains of Tibet who's never heard about Jesus?" Very wisely, this pastor didn't go down that rabbit trail. He looked me in the eye and he said, "You know, Raphael, I don't really know about that man up in the mountains of Tibet that's never heard of Jesus, but you heard of Jesus. What is your excuse?" That hit me like a sledgehammer. The eyes of my understanding were open, and all of a sudden I just dropped to my knees and surrendered my life to Christ. That was on a Tuesday, April 15th, 1975, at 11 o'clock at night. I was baptized that Sunday, and then shortly thereafter I flew back to Calgary to ask my wife to forgive me. My son had just turned 4, and even though she wasn't a Christian, she didn't want to raise our son without a father. So we came to Houston, and shortly thereafter, she became a Christian. I began pouring the Word of God into my son Ted when he was 4 years old, and just reading the Bible to him every night. And when he was 8 years old, he surrendered his life to Christ also as his Lord and Savior. Christ has revolutionized my life, and I'll tell you, it is the most wonderful experience to live and walk with the living Christ.
Pastor Cruz, I appreciate you sharing your testimony with us, and I noticed that when you were saved, you had mentioned you had gone back to Calgary, of course, that being in Canada, to go and reunite with your wife and your son. Of course, that was a big controversy back in 2016 when your son Ted was running for president, the fact that he had been born in Canada. But we won't discuss that on today's show. But what we will do here is we will take a break. And when we come back from the break, there are a lot of things that I want to talk to you about.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Back, and it is an honor to have with us today Pastor Raphael Cruz, the father of U.S. Senator Ted Cruz. Raphael Cruz's website is graceforamerica.org. That's a website that you'll want to check out, graceforamerica.org. Pastor Cruz, what I want to do now is I want to switch gears just a little bit. You talked about your son Ted at the time when he was 8 years old and he accepted Christ as his Savior. I want to ask you about your son Ted specifically. What was he like? I mean, tell me not about Ted Cruz, the senator, not Ted Cruz, the presidential candidate back in 2016, but tell me about Ted Cruz, your son, the boy that you raised and grew into a man.
Well, I'll tell you, he was always very inquisitive. He was always asking questions. Why was probably the most frequent word that would come out of his mouth. He wanted to know about everything. And actually, I remember when he had just turned 9 years old. This was end of 1979. And of course, as I said before, that was when Carter was involved in government, and I became involved with the Religious Roundtable. Well, because of that, our conversation around the dinner table all through 1980 was as to why we had to get rid of this progressive, liberal Jimmy Carter and replace him with a constitutional conservative like Ronald Reagan. So my son got a dose of conservative politics every day for a year when he was 9 years old. One interesting bit of, I remember 2 years later, we were at the beach in Cancun, Mexico, on vacation, and Ted saw a fisherman that had a small octopus on his arm, and he obviously said, "Hey, I want that octopus on my arm," and that octopus bit him, and his arm swelled. We were in Mexico. We didn't know what to do. We didn't come back to Houston until 3 days later. Got to the doctor, and the doctor said, "Well, we've had. I've seen in the records a few incidences of octopus bite, and there've been some people that have died, but there's nothing we can do about it." So we spent a couple of weeks just really very nervous about, but it cleared away, and everything went fine. But I think what was the most pivotal in his life, besides his surrendering his life to Christ, was when he was 13. We introduced him to an organization called the Free Enterprise Institute. So Ted has just turned 13. He's reading Adam Smith and John Locke and von Mises and Hayek and Bastiat and Milton Friedman and the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers at 13 years old. And then this organization created a group of 5 kids. They called them the Constitutional Corroborators. Ted was one of those 5. They hired a memory expert, and they taught these 5 kids to memorize the U.S. Constitution. For the next 4 years, my son Ted gave approximately 80 speeches on free market economics and the Constitution. Before Ted left high school, he was passionate about the Constitution. He was passionate about the Declaration, about free markets, about limited government, about the rule of law. That passion became like fire in his bones. And I'll tell you, the reason I know my son Ted Cruz will not compromise his principles in Washington is that fire is as alive today as it was over 30 years ago.
So I know that you feel that you've been called of God into the ministry. Does your son feel as though he's been called of God into public or political service?
Well, I'll tell you what, I remember earlier in his life, he had talked about he wanted to be a computer programmer, or he wanted to go into artificial intelligence and be a scientist. And I remember he's telling me even that towards the end of high school. And I said, "Ted, you're a people person. You will go nuts inside of an office." And of course, before he left high school, with all that involvement on the Constitution, he was certain that he wanted to devote his life to public service. He loves this country. He loves America. He has a love for people that is really genuine. And that love to be a servant just got him into to go and study public policy and then go on to law school and clerk for William Rehnquist. What a wonderful man. And of course, William Rehnquist was an inspiration to Ted. The other day I ran across someone who went to high school with Ted. And he said, Ted was a little weird. When he was in high school, we were talking about football. He was talking about Ronald Reagan.
You'd mentioned Chief Justice Rehnquist back in 2001 when the Indianapolis Baptist Temple case was making its way up to the Supreme Court. I decided that I was going to go and speak to the Supreme Court. The Constitution gives us the right to redress our grievances to our government. It doesn't exactly tell us, though, how we're supposed to go about doing that. And so I just showed up at the Supreme Court. I'm quite sure that Chief Justice Rehnquist thought that I was a tremendous annoyance and nuisance, but yet in his dealing with me and in his speaking with me, which he did, he was a gentleman. And so I have to give him that, even if he didn't like the fact that I was there or agree with the things that I was saying.
Yes, he was. And he was very committed, a man that deeply loved this country. And, he reshaped the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court really became, when he went to the court, the Supreme Court was quite liberal. And he was able to reshape the court. A man of great conviction. And for Ted to sit at his feet, he was one of the great mentors of his life, and that actually has had a great influence on his life, and it only deepened his love for the Constitution, his love for the rule of law, and for against judicial activism to just restore America to those constitutional principles which are really based on the Word of God. And so he has truly a servant spirit, and I think Rehnquist inspired a lot of that. Of course, the life of Jesus inspired that too, because Jesus said that the greatest thing you can do is to be a servant of all.
One thing that the Bible tells us is to pray for those who are in positions of government. And of course, I know you would pray for your son as his father, but you also pray for him as a citizen, as one of his constituents. How do you pray for your son, and how should we pray for him?
Ted and his wife and family, they spent 6 months in prayer, just seeking the will of God as to what to do. And that culminated one time that the whole family was together, and even his senior staff. We were attending a church service all together at First Baptist Church of Houston, where he's a member. And after church, we went up to the pastor's office. We spent 2 hours on our knees seeking God's will. And it was there where Heidi said a word that, I believe it was just inspiration from God. And she said, seek God's face, not God's hand. He really, truly does it with a spirit of service. He has a spirit of being a servant with the people. Unfortunately, so many politicians think that we work for them, when in reality, they work for us. They work for we the people. And he understands that very clearly. His love for the Lord is manifested in his love for all people across America. And he wants to be a servant to everyone in America, to the hardworking men and women of America who are struggling to make their ends meet, who want to achieve the American dream, who so many today feel that is out of reach. But, he wants to bring back that hope and inspiration to restore again that shining city on a hill, that wonderful country that is the United States of America. And I believe God's greatest days for America are still ahead. I am very encouraged about the future of America.
Well, we are coming up on time for our next break, but when we come back from it, what I want to ask you is specifically how your son Ted, be it as a United States Senator, or if he should end up being nominated to the Supreme Court in Trump's second term, or in whatever position and capacity God gives him to serve this country. specifically, how will he help return the United States of America back to its Christian foundation? Because definitely that is a train that has gone off the rail.
You know what you talked about is so, I don't know, did you say you want to take a break?
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, read all about it.
We're back, and we're privileged to have with us today Pastor Raphael Cruz, the father of Senator Ted Cruz. Sorry I had to interrupt you there a moment ago, but we did need to take a break. We're back now, and so I'd like for you to go ahead and answer that question that you were beginning to answer before the break.
But I want to answer that question that you asked before the break about revival. You know, if we look at the 1700s, you know, most Americans think the American Revolution started in the 1770s, but that's not true. Actually, the American Revolution started in the 1730s with men like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield and many others. And it was the first Great Awakening that was the spark for the American Revolution. As a matter of fact, the first Great Awakening and the American Revolution are so intertwined that you cannot separate them. They're one and the same. You see, if you look at, for example, the Declaration of Independence, there's some 26 grievances against King George in the Declaration of Independence. But most Americans may be not aware of the fact that each and every one of those grievances were preached in the pulpits of America for 10 years prior to their being written in the Declaration of Independence. You know, my friend David Barton says you could consider the Declaration of Independence as a series of sermon summaries. To give you another example, when Paul Revere was in his famous ride, he was going somewhere. He was going to the home of a pastor by the name of Jonas Clark. The very first battle for our independence, the Battle of Lexington, was fought right outside Pastor Jonas Clark. And the pastor and the men of his congregation were an integral part of that militia. As a matter of fact, there were 8 colonies that died at the Battle of Lexington. 7 of those 8 were members of Pastor Jonas Clark's church. But, you know, that has been erased from our history books because it's not politically correct. So in the 1700s, we had a dual revival. It was a spiritual and a political revival all tied into one. Well, I think we're about to see the same thing happen in America. A spiritual revival together with a political revival. You know, there's a great emphasis among Christians today, and even among Jewish people too, on 2 Chronicles 7:14, which says, if my people who are called by my name, that's the people of God, shall humble themselves and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then God says, I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sin, I will heal their land. We must start on our knees in prayer. But we go in prayer to seek God's will, to be in the presence of God, to get vision and direction for God, to be empowered by God, to do the work that God commands us to do. So there is a second half of that equation. The second half of that equation is 2 Corinthians 5:20, which says that we are ambassadors for Christ. That means we're God's representatives here on earth. We're God's hands, we're God's feet, we're God's mouthpiece. And Jesus said, shout it from the housetops. That's why I called my book A Time for Action. We must put our faith in action. We must put feet to our prayers. So towards the end of my book, I talk about 5 steps that Christians, people of faith, need to put into action in order to restore America. And of course, we must begin with prayer. But again, I repeat, we must put feet to our prayer and put those prayers into action, translate them into action. We can't just continue to just be inside the 4 walls of a church. We need to take the message of Christ, the message of freedom. Galatians chapter 5, verse 1 says, "For freedom's sake, Christ has made us free. So do not entangle yourselves again with the yoke of bondage." We must make sure we protect the freedom that we have in this wonderful country of ours. And that is a call to action.
Well, Pastor Cruz, I know you're busy, and I know we've already gone past the amount of time that you said you would give me today. And so I just want to thank you for being our guest here on TBR Radio Presents the TBR History Hour.
God bless you. God bless each and every one of you listeners.
Welcome to the Christendom curriculum. You know, every parent who decides to homeschool wants to secure a great education for their child, while also saving time and money. But these days, many parents have another concern. They also want a homeschool curriculum without all the multiculturalist, politically correct diversity doctrine that's really little more than a thin disguise for an anti-Christian, anti-American, and anti-Western civilization bias. Now there is such a curriculum. The Christendom curriculum gives your children a complete education in Bible, history, literature, and more, focusing on the classic academic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic. But we also tell the story of Christendom, the story of the Christian nations, especially as Christ's kingdom has been historically manifest in the nations of Europe and America. And we do so without apology. The Christendom curriculum is the only Christian nationalist homeschool program you'll find. We support the right of the European and American peoples to their historic Christian cultures against the globalist leftists who want to destroy those cultures. Not only that, but we provide assigned reading courses for various hot-button subjects in our current culture wars, including feminism, social justice, and cultural Marxism, among others. These reading courses will teach your kids how to survive a social justice warrior attack, how to debate with leftists on social media, how to reform their local churches and communities, and more. We're living in a time of tremendous historical and social change. Christians have the opportunity now to begin building the culture and civilization of the next 1,000 years and beyond. It's an exciting time to be alive. So if you want to help raise the next generation of culture warriors, if you want your children to grow up with a love for Christ's kingdom and for their own nation, while at the same time learning how to defend America and rebuild the West, the easy-to-use Christendom curriculum is for you. Click the Learn More button to get in on the action. And thanks for listening.
Before the interview, we had asked Pastor Cruz if he would just sit down and record for us the story. Tell us exactly what happened growing up in Cuba, being a part of the revolution in Cuba, having to flee Cuba because of being part of the revolution in Cuba, how he became a revolutionary, how he became an American patriot, and also then, of course, what were the similarities between what he saw as communism took a hold of Cuba and now that communism and Marxism are taking a hold of America. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to play that segment. And I'm not going to ask any questions of Pastor Cruz. I'm just going to let him speak freely and just tell his story.
Hello, it is so good to be with you today. I want to share some of my experiences with communism. I was born in Cuba, and when I was 13 years old in 1952, a communist-inspired dictatorship took over Cuba. And it was a very oppressive military dictatorship. Dissidents were killed by the thousands. And a year after this dictator took power, in 1953, a young charismatic leader by the name of Fidel Castro with a group of university students attacked an army garrison in the easternmost part of Cuba. Most of those young kids were killed, but Fidel Castro and his brother were arrested and went to trial, and instead of going to prison, they were exiled to Mexico. And so from Mexico, they began a revolution and began encouraging students, university students and high school students, to get involved in what at the time was called the underground, something not very different to the resistance movement in France during the Second World War. And so I found myself being involved in a revolution as a teenager, and primarily involved in sabotage, training, trying to recruit people for the revolution to come. After I graduated from high school at the age of 17, I moved to the city of Santiago in the easternmost part of the country to go to college. I reported to the underground there, and I remember at the end of November, it was November 29th of 1956, about 100 of us kids were summoned to an empty high school building where we were told by the leader of the revolution there, Castro is arriving tomorrow morning. What we are going to do is 50 of us are going to attack the police station at 7 o'clock in the morning, and the second group of 50 is going to be within a block of an army garrison that Castro is going to attack, and these other 50, which I was a part of, were to be the support troops for Castro's attack of the army garrison. So at 7 o'clock in the morning, 50 of us in little groups of 2 or 3 or 4 all around that army garrison were awaiting for Castro. We didn't even have any weapons. Castro was going to provide us the weapons. Shortly after 7 o'clock, we had a runner come by, abort, Castro didn't land. Unfortunately, the people at the police station never got the memo, and most of those kids were killed. And so I thought to myself, well, I got lucky. I was in the other group. Well, of course, with the massacre that had occurred at the police station, the army was on high alert. They were going through the city trying to find anybody that they could arrest. So 4 of us who were in the underground decided that we better get out of the city. The university immediately shut down all classes. So 4 of us got in a car and began driving out of town. And we got stopped by an army patrol and got arrested. They put all 4 of us in the army truck, and one of the soldiers drove our car behind us. They took us to that same army garrison that we were supposed to be attacking. I remember as they walked us in, soldiers crying out, "To the firing squad, to the firing squad." And I thought for sure that was going to be my last day on earth. But again, you could say I got lucky. By mistake, other soldiers had arrested the son of an army major who was a college buddy of ours. He didn't know we were on the underground. They had arrested him by mistake, and they were just released him. As we saw him, all 4 of us cried out his name. He came towards us, and he vouched for us, and we were released. And again, I thought, boy, I was lucky. And so the 4 of us drove to our hometown some 500 miles away. I reported to the underground in my hometown. A few months later, I got arrested by the army. I had tried to recruit someone for the underground who was an informer, so I got arrested. I was taken to an army garrison and went through a very severe beating. It was unthinkable. Just to the point that you didn't feel any pain until you collapse. And then they would throw me in a cell, and a few hours later they would take me back out, and the torture started all over again. And this was repeatedly. After I collapsed, they would wait 3 or 4 hours and do it again. And certainly I thought, this is the end of me. Because typically when the Batista regime arrested somebody, typically a few days later that individual would appear shot on the streets with a gun in his hand. And the headlines were always the same. This person tried to attack an army patrol and was killed in self-defense. So I thought that would be my fate also. But little did I know. One day I was taken early in the morning to the colonel who was at the head of that army garrison. And this colonel said to me, "We are going to release you, but if a bomb explodes in this city, we're coming to get you." I remember that I said to this man, "What, Colonel, how can I be responsible for what other people do?" He looked me in the eye and he said, "I don't give a flip. If a bomb explodes in this city, I'm coming to get you." Well, when they released me, I was able to call my father, and my father picked me up. My clothes were just drenched in blood. I was all beaten up. He threw me in the car, took me home, and of course my mother and my sister were hysterical when they saw my clothes, red with clothes, and I had to have medical attention for all my injuries. And then I had to have dental surgeries because they had knocked my 4 front teeth in the top and the bottom. So I went through oral surgery, and then I had a plate installed for the top and the bottom of my 4 teeth. So, there may be some of you in your 60s or 70s that have had a plate in your mouth. I had 2 plates from the time I was 18 years old. I had not been home for any more than an hour. When a lady whom I didn't know, but she was from the underground, came to the house, and she said, "You have to get out of the country. They know who you are. You are no more used to the underground. They have assigned people to follow you 24 hours a day, hoping that you will contact your superiors. And you are a risk to the underground. You need to get out of the country." Well, by this time, Castro had landed. Most of his people had been killed, but he, with a handful of people, had gone to the mountains and began recruiting farmers and started the revolution in the mountains. We still thought he was a good guy. He was this guy that was talking about hope and change. Those words may sound familiar to you. Of course, we never were told change to what. He portrayed himself as a liberator. And so I said to this woman, "Well, can't I go to the mountains?" And she said to me, "No, the Batista army has the mountains surrounded. There's no way to get in." And again, you could say I was lucky because that choice was not open to me. Had it been, in all probability, I would have been killed in the mountains like most of the people that were up there were. I had been a straight A student during high school, so I figured the best way to get out of Cuba is with a student visa. I wrote to 3 universities in the United States, and the University of Texas was the first one to accept me. That's how I became a Texan. So with the acceptance letter from the University of Texas, I was able to obtain a 4-year student visa from the U.S. Embassy. And then my only thing else I needed is I needed a permit to the equivalent of the KGB to get out of the country. A permit from the government allowing me to give me an exit visa. Well, my father had a friend who was a lawyer who paid someone in the Batista government to stamp my passport with an exit visa. So one morning, after I had my passport and my visa and my exit permit, with my father's car in the garage, I laid on the back seat of the car, and my father got in the car with my mother and my sister, and they drove to Havana, to a dock where my father had previously bought a ticket on a ferry boat. I had a visa, I had an exit permit, so I was able to get on that ferry boat. It was a very, very emotional departure. I didn't know I would ever be able to see my sister or my parents again. My sister was crying. My father was very stern, trying to contain the tears from my eyes, his eyes. But my mother was also hysterical. I embraced them and I got on that boat, not knowing if I will see it again, but excited about coming to the land of the free and the home of the brave. I arrived that evening in Key West and got a Greyhound bus all the way to Austin, Texas, and enrolled in the University of Texas. This was in late August of 1957. 1959, Castro took over, and we still thought Castro was a good guy. I mean, he claimed that he was fighting for freedom and to give Cubans a new hope. When Castro took over, shortly after that, I went back to Cuba. And did I ever get a shock of my life? That same man that had been talking about hope and change was now talking about how the rich were evil, about how they oppressed the poor, and about the need to redistribute the wealth. I think we heard something similar not too many years ago here in America. Castro began confiscating private property. A few weeks ago, I was talking on Facebook Live about the 10 tenets of the Communist Manifesto. The number one, the first tenet of the Communist Manifesto is the confiscation of all private property. And Castro wasted no time. He began confiscating first big factories and then small businesses. Anybody who was a business owner was an enemy of the revolution, and they saw their businesses confiscated. Anybody whom they labeled the rich were enemies of the revolution, and they had even their homes confiscated. And they went as far as anybody who was a lawyer or a medical doctor or maybe an engineering consultant. Those were the rich. The next thing they did is they began what were called the People's Tribunals. They began just gathering anyone whom they thought was not a supporter of the revolution. And if you were not a supporter of the revolution, de facto, you were against the revolution. At these People's Tribunals, the people they brought in there were not even allowed to have a defense. When the tribunal would say, you're obviously guilty, you do not need a defense. The verdict was always the same. Guilty to the firing squad. And they executed thousands upon thousands of people that were not, quote, supporting the revolution. The person in charge of those firing squads was Che Guevara. I'm sure you've seen college kids in America wearing Che Guevara t-shirts. They think he is a folk hero. Che Guevara was one of the biggest mass murderers that have ever existed. Che Guevara boasted that he loved to go to those firing squads, and just before those soldiers fired their rifle, he would fire the first shot with his revolver. He boasted that he personally killed over 1,000 people in those firing squads. And then they began putting pastors in prison, putting priests in prison, because you see, communism necessitates to eradicate the concept of God. Why? Because government must become your God. And you see it, all these socialist politicians that have a strong anti-Christian emphasis. They want secular humanism because government must become your God. So there can be no allegiance to God. Churches, many of them were closed, but they let some churches, the main denominational churches, the larger churches, they allowed them to remain open under the control of the government, where they had government inspectors, basically stooges, trying to watch and monitor everything that pastor would say. And as long as the pastor just tickled people's ears and didn't get involved on what was happening in the country, they were okay. They could talk about Jesus inside the four walls. If they dared talk about Jesus outside the four walls of the church, they were arrested, because evangelism was against the law. You could not proselyte because it was an assault against allegiance to the government. And then, of course, everybody saw a total collapse of the economy, because they said everybody must be paid the same. What happens when everybody gets paid the same? Nobody works. We saw it in America the first year that the Pilgrims came to Plymouth Plantation. Those Pilgrims decided to try a communist experiment. They said, look, we got all this land before us. Why don't we work this land together and share equally in what the land produces? It may sound very pretty, but that was a total failure. And you could see why it would be a total failure. Because maybe somebody could work 10, 12 hours a day, but maybe somebody else only worked like 2 hours a day. How long do you think that other guy was going to work 12 hours a day, while this other one worked 2 hours a day, and they got paid the same? Probably no more than a week. So nobody worked. They almost starved to death. As a matter of fact, half of them died that first year. But they were smart enough and flexible enough that at the end of that year, they went before Governor Bradford. And they said, Governor, this didn't work. So Governor Bradford said, all right, each of you take your own plot of land. You work the land, you feed your family. And the free enterprise system was born in America that first year of our existence. Now the question is this: if we tried it 400 years ago and it didn't work, why would we be dumb enough to try it again? But let's get back to Cuba. So in Cuba, now they began imposing rationing. What happened is the economy collapsed, so starvation, lack of food was predominant. And so everybody was issued a ration card. You still had to buy your food, but to give you an idea, for many, many years, meat has been rationed in Cuba to a half a pound per person per month. Half a pound per month. That's 8 ounces. You know, we go to a restaurant and ordering an 8-ounce steak, that's a small steak. That is the total amount of meat anybody in Cuba can buy in a month. And everything else was rationed. And of course, we saw just a couple of months ago one of the leftist socialist politicians in America boasting about Cuba having 100% literacy rate. Let me tell you what literacy means in a communist country. Communist indoctrination. In Cuba, every child from 3 years old on up needs to be in a public school to receive communist indoctrination every day. To give you an idea, a story that my mother told me, soldiers will come into a kindergarten class and will say to the children, okay, children, close your eyes and pray to God for candy. And then they would say, okay, open your eyes. Where's the candy? No candy. All right, close your eyes again and pray to Fidel for candy. And while the children had their eyes closed, the soldiers very quietly will put candy on all their desks. It is communist indoctrination, compulsory from the age of 3 years old. The other thing those children were told is their allegiance was to the government. And if they heard their parents speaking against the government, it was their civic duty to denounce their parents. Again, breaking down the family unit, because again, you cannot have loyalty to your family. What do we see in America today? Unfortunately, we see 50% of college students thinking that socialism is a better system than free enterprise. Why? Because universities in the United States are plagued with Marxist professors, and they are brainwashing those kids. As a matter of fact, if you ask the average college kid, tell me the definition of socialism, this is what they will tell you. Socialism is the control of the means of production by the people. That is a lie. Socialism is the control of the means of production by almighty government.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
Know that today was not the ordinary type of interview that we would do here on TBR Radio Presents the TBR History Hour. I know I enjoyed getting to find out about the boyhood of Ted Cruz and getting to know his father, Pastor Raphael Cruz, just a little bit. And I hope that you did too. I hope that something that Pastor Raphael said maybe about his time in Cuba, or what he said about communism, you know, when he was talking about Fidel being the preacher of hope and change. And again, that sounds very familiar. Those were the catchwords of Barack Obama. A lot of profound stuff that we've covered here on today's show. And so I hope that you have been thought-provoked in some way. I'd like to encourage you to go to Raphael's website, graceforamerica.org. I'd also like to encourage you to go to our website, www.barnesreview.org. And when you're at the Barnes Review website, check out the bookstore. We have some great books in there. Also, if you're not already a subscriber to the Barnes Review, you are missing out. Subscribe to the Barnes Review today. You will be glad that you did. And, of course, we'll be back again next week. We always come back every Friday. And so, same time, same place, we'll do it again. Until then, check out our YouTube channel. Click like and subscribe. That'll help us out quite a bit. So from all of us here at TBR Radio presents the TBR History Hour, I want to say thank you for being our guest once again, and God bless. I'll see you again next week.